All right, Andy here. We are in part 7 of my AI series. This one is short and sweet compared to the other videos, and it's about the recommendations I have. So let's just go ahead and get started. Here we are, my recommendations. I want to caveat this, start with a few caveats. One is that a lot of my reasoning for the recommendations is in the previous parts. So it might look, if you've not looked at those, that I'm just sort of, coming up with these out of nowhere. I'll say a little bit about them and why. But if you really want to get the full benefit of why, which I think is the more important part than the actual recommendations, then check out those other videos. The other thing I just want to caveat, although I hope it's obvious, is that these are just my personal recommendations. And it's up to you whether you follow them, frankly. I hope it's clear why I'm suggesting them, but you do you, me do me. All right, so here are my recommendations. And this is what I've previously gone through. I'm just going to kind of recap the highlights from all of those just to set the groundwork for the recommendations, and then we can, talk about what can we do. So yeah, the very beginning, part 1, I talked a little bit about how LLMs work. We learned that they're basically text auto-completion. They find which passages of text are more plausible than others. The ones that are images and videos, doing the same thing with videos. What that means, and the reason they've gotten so good is that essentially we've been able to give them a lot more computation and training data than previously we have. And that's really what's driven this. So basically they just got trillions of parameters. They can often memorize large bits of things, and it sort of boggles the human capacity to really understand the qualitative change in performance you get with that amount of increase. But because this is the way that LLMs work, they don't have a sense of ground truth or concepts in the way that people do. They don't have experience in the world. They don't have senses of causation, theory of mind. What they've learned is which words or images follow which others. They don't have this sort of, deeper kinds of things. It's an open area of study, whether they have something that looks kind of like that. But at the very least, we know that they don't have anything like humans do, and it's not grounded in the world. They don't have a sense of what is true or false, only what is plausible or not. And what they were actually designed to do was just produce output that people like, which means that it's output that is perceived to be helpful or friendly, whether it is or not, and that we interpret in a positive way. Okay, so keep this in mind because that drives a lot of the impacts that we're seeing. It means also that it's going to make errors because it has to generalize beyond what it's trained on. It has to make images or texts that it hasn't seen before. Because it doesn't have a sense of truth, it's going to make errors in doing that. Errors that are kind of unlike sometimes what people would do, and errors that you need a fair amount of sophistication and knowledge to be able to detect because they'll come out in the details. And so if you don't have a grasp on the details, you won't see them. Turning to human learning, we've seen that the way humans learn things is we really need practice. And in order to be good at something high level, you really need lots of practice at the lower levels so that practice can put that in the long-term memory, and you have more capacity in the short-term memory to do the higher level stuff. So practice makes perfect is very, very true on a fundamental neural level, and you cannot shortcut this. And assessments are there to make us do that practice. The process of the assessment is the purpose of the assessment. It can't be skipped if you want to learn things. You need to do that practice at the right level depending on your development. So when you look at sort of how LLMs are used in learning, what we see is that sometimes they're perceived, people think that they're helpful, but they're not actually helpful. People think they're better because, again, they've been trained to produce stuff that people think is good, but people don't have, if you're learning, you don't have the expertise to see where it's not helping. And in fact, if you look at the actual outcomes of LLM use without guardrails or anything like that, it generally hurts learning, and probably hurts our agency. Primarily because it undermines that practice. It undermines the deep processing engagement we need to develop the real skills. Okay, while all the time hiding that it's doing that. People think it's helping. And I think the story with our more general well-being, not just learning, is similar. So if you look at the role of LLMs in social connection, which is a huge driver of human well-being, LLMs fill a niche because they're kind of the junk food of social connection. They are easier social connection. And so especially if you're lonely or struggling, LLMs are there. But instead of facilitating and making it so that, they help things, what they do, or what they seem to do, as far as I can tell from the research is on there, is sort of they make it easier to not do the hard practice necessary to make connections with people. And they might even be more actively harmful for some people. And more generally, I think this is a big concern about LLMs, which is, the mismatch between what LLMs do and what we are evolved to do. We are evolved to basically trust and connect with each other, and LLMs undermine that process of shared meaning making. And we saw that with the social connection and the well-being, but also very much we see it in terms of what's happening in our information systems. Disinformation is a much larger problem than LLMs, but LLMs supercharge what disinformation does, and drive the increase in distrust, erosion of our common ground. And as a disinformation researcher, they frighten me. In terms of the impacts on society as a whole, more generally, this is where I have less expertise, but as far as I can tell, the effects on the workplace are more variable, but I think have been overstated, partly because I think, OpenAI and them are going to overstate everything. But I think it needs to be interpreted with caution. What we can tell is, I think that LLMs, for novices, they appear to improve productivity, but not in a way that, often either sends poor products for someone else to fix, or in a way that, undermines the development of expertise. So they stay novices. And for experts, I'm not sure they help at all. And more generally, I think there's a big danger of embedding into our lives or our organization tools that we don't actually control and don't understand. And the economic process, the business model is enshittification, to have us trapped there, increase the price, and then we're stuck. And I think that's a huge danger. And then finally, I talked about the environmental impact of LLMs, which as far as I can tell is even worse than I thought. So what do we do? Now, I want to give recommendations for actual normal people. That is, this is not a recommendation for sort of as a society, regulation and stuff, partly because that's not my expertise, and partly because I don't know if anyone with the actual power to do those things is going to watch these videos anyways. So these are recommendations for you or me. So you're a student, you're a parent, you're a teacher, you're an office worker, maybe you're in charge of your organization and you have to make decisions about that for your organization. These recommendations will hopefully be helpful for you. And I basically have two kinds. One is a set of recommendations if even after all this you're thinking, well, I still want to use some, how do I use them safely? Or I don't really want to use them, but I'm being forced to because of my job or whatever. How do I use them safely? And then I've just got some more general ones that aren't if you have to. So, but what if you have to? Well, the first thing I want to say is really watch out for FOMO, fear of missing out. And make sure that you actually have to, and it's not FOMO that's driving this. If you're going to use AI, make sure that it's on a demonstrated need and a defined use case, not a vague sort of, well, everyone's doing it, or, well, they say this will help, or whatever. And then you basically, start using it and blah, 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 and because we're so bad at judging whether it's actually helpful or because there's sunk costs, I'm going to talk about those later, then you get stuck. Even before starting to use it, ask yourself specifically, what do you want it for? take your time, think about it. Don't let emotion and fear drive this decision. Listen to your emotions, but then make the decision in a state of calm. Don't make a decision out of state of panic. I see so many individuals, and more individuals than individuals, organizations, feeling this FOMO of everyone's doing it, we're going to be left behind. I actually don't think so. And go to part 6 if you see why. I don't actually think it's actually going to benefit the organization or individual that much. But if it does, it's because you've made a considered specific use case for your LLM. You've probably designed it for that use case. You're not just using an off-the-shelf thing. You're doing training for it. You're measuring it. Then maybe use it, okay? But if you're not doing that, if it's just, well, I've got to try it because everyone is, it's probably not going to help you, and it may hurt you. So that kind of relates to this other thing, which is avoid magical thinking. A lot of the FOMO is driven by, well, everyone's doing it, it's got to work out, or even if it's not working now, it will later, without thinking how. And so that's what I always want to ask when people make claims of, just do prompt engineering or this is going to happen. How? Spell out this mechanism. Because as soon as you do that, it falls into dust. And that's kind of a general thing about LLMs is, LLMs are good at vague generalities. So are, the people who are driving the hype. And the way to get past it is always the same in all cases, is drill down to the details. That means you might need to do a little expertise building yourself to understand the details. But the details are where you can tell liars from non-liars, okay? And so when you're making a decision, make sure that you don't do this to yourself. Make sure you're clear about the mechanism by which you expect AI to help. Articulate that to yourself. Don't use an LLM to do it. Articulate to yourself. What specifically are you going to use it for? How will that help? Consider the impacts both positive and negative. So don't just think about, like, oh, it'll help in this way. Think about what's the negative. What time would I be losing because I'm spending that? What do I need to give up to make space for this? There's a very interesting psychological result, which is that people find it way easier to consider additive changes than subtractive ones. Essentially, they don't think about the opportunity costs, right? If you're going to make a change, think about what is this stopping me from doing? And also, if I'm going to make this, what am I going to need to take away, right? That often can really help make it a lot clearer whether you actually want to use it or not. Then, finally, suppose you have an LLM or you're forced to use it. How do you use it more safely? And I think my best advice is to treat an LLM like an intern. And this is really helpful for me because I have interns. If you've not had an intern, that might be less helpful. So I'll spell out what that means. Essentially, an intern is someone that you get that is bright and eager and has kind of some training, but not much. They're a novice. And the reason you have an intern is essentially for their skill development, usually. They are not usually contributing much, or if they are contributing something, it's kind of low-level work that you don't want to do, but that has to be done, right? What they get out of it is the skills boost that you're giving them and the connections. What you get out of it is the doing the low-level work, okay? So an LLM, I think, is actually very much like an intern in terms of its capabilities and what you can expect out of it. When you have an intern, because they are, not that well trained, you always have to be very careful what work you delegate them, and you always have to build checks into the process. Same thing with LLMs. I don't think you should use LLMs for something you don't know how to do yourself, because you cannot check it. And also you won't learn how to do it, right? So there's just no, it will do something. It might be doing something badly. You don't know. And you're also not going to learn how to do it yourself because you're having an LLM do it. And I think a lot of the people who are like, oh, I really benefit from LLMs writing, my ad copy or whatever. Okay, I don't know much about ads. But I want to ask, so how will you learn to do this yourself? And if you suddenly lost your LLM tool, would you be able to do it? And I also kind of want to ask, if it made a mistake, would you catch that, right? So I think I would not use I would not have an intern do something that I didn't know how to do myself, unless I had someone on my team who knew how to do it and could catch it. for those reasons. And I don't think you should use an LLM either. And then the other thing is that if you're going to use an LLM, you need to build checking into the process in a thorough way and not in a way that you eventually stop doing, right? Because same thing with an intern. You can't just be like, oh, first week I'll check on them and then after that they can go do whatever and, totally change our company's database or whatever. No, you have to keep checking. Um, uh, because the probability of LLMs making errors is not going to go down over time. The liability is also going to remain. And if you don't have the capacity to build this checking into the process, then just don't use an LLM. We don't have interns do certain things. Don't that's the trade-off of doing an LLM, of using an LLM, I think. And I think fundamentally this is where it requires us to be honest with ourselves. If you know you're going to, or think you're going to lapse into problematic usage, you'll maybe start out but give up on the checking or rely on more and more, then, be kind to your future self. Don't set yourself up to fail, just don't use it. And that's part of why I don't use them, is because I know I'm kind of lazy. And I think if I started using them, the only thing I use them for is to actually research them. Um, if I use them for something else, I think that it would be pretty easy to slide into, oh, well, this doesn't cost, anything. This doesn't have this problem. And that's how errors and cognitive offloading and all the things I talked about in the previous videos happen. Fundamentally, I think, there's this meme going around, and I think it goes around because there's a truth of it. We want AI to do our intern tasks, the low-level things that are really boring, not art and writing. And so, use LLMs for that. Don't offload it, don't give LLMs tasks that you wouldn't give interns either. Save the cool stuff for yourself. The hard, interesting, the coding, the writing, the creative stuff. It's harder. It's difficult, but it's also the rewarding stuff. So, yeah, that's my advice. Also, if you must use LLMs, please come up with some evaluation metric. Don't just check for errors, but come up with some evaluation metric for them that is objective. Because as we've seen in so much of this research, people's subjective sense is that it helps when it actually doesn't. So before you use an LLM, decide ahead of time, how are you going to test the impact in ways that aren't just self-assessment, that measure actually what you want it to do, and that aren't gameable by you, because our brains are really good at gaming things, right? Remember that because they're designed to feel helpful, and using them undermines the normal signals we get about our own performance, that just asking people, was this helpful, is not a useful signal. You want to define your measure clearly in advance. You can change it later, but you want to define it clearly in advance because again, it's really easy to play little games with ourselves and be like, oh, that measure doesn't matter or whatever, to support things that we are emotionally motivated to want to do anyways. Also, defining something clearly in advance makes you think through very clearly, what do I want it actually to achieve, okay? It should not rely on subjective report, at least not mainly on. You can maybe have that as part of your measure. And the other thing is, and it should actually reflect the thing you care about. Like if you want to improve, say, developer productivity time, it should be the amount of time spent on things. If you want to, make sure it's actually measuring what you want. And then finally, and this goes back to my last point, keep evaluating it, right? Don't stop. So you can track changes over time. You can track also the impacts elsewhere. You really need to measure this stuff if you're going to use it. And I'm talking about this mainly sort of for organizations, but I think as an individual you can as well. Like if you think, oh, LLMs are going to help me with my studies, well, do a randomized design on yourself. Take one unit, use LLMs to help. Take another unit, use them not to, compare your performance on it. Like you can do things, test them objectively, see if it's helping. And then I guess finally, suppose, you find that it's not helping, beware the sunk cost fallacy. Most people I think know what sunk costs are. You need to essentially be able to, if you find that it's not working, be able to walk away or change your mind. And part of that is keeping them, this is just general advice, not about LLMs, but in particular LLMs, if you've been using one or your organization has been using one, you think this is not working out, let yourself walk away. Don't continue with a bad choice just because you've already invested something in it. It's a fallacy because whether you've invested something or not, is doesn't affect what's going to happen in the future. You need to make the best choice for the future based on the situation at present, right? And we have lots of colloquialisms about this. Don't throw good money after bad. And the reason I mention this in the context of LLMs is that enshittification as a business strategy relies on people doing this, right? Doing the sunk cost thing. And so I implore you, don't, right? And then finally, also, keep this in mind before you're deciding to use them. So have a backup plan. Keep your backup plan viable. Don't throw something all in on using LLMs because you need to be able to walk away if they're not working. All right, so that's my advice for, if you really, after everything I've said, still need or want to use LLMs, I think those are how to use them more safely. More generally, and this is going to get, abstract and touchy-feely, but that's who I am, and, you've lived through 7 videos, so you get to put up with this. I have some general recommendations for approaching LLMs and AI in general. And I think the first one I have is, it's okay not to use it. It's okay not to use AI at all. And I feel like sometimes people feel like they have to because everyone else is. That's part of the FOMO thing. And if you need permission from someone who kind of understands AI and all this stuff to say, no, you don't need to, it's okay not to, here is permission. If you think about what we value as humans, it is meanings, connections, and doing things for other people, right? You look at the things that we value: art, science, learning, culture. It's this collaborative meaning-making process. And I don't think LLMs are helping with any of that. And even if AI were perfect, even if there were no environmental impacts, I think we rely on it for these things at our deep peril because all of them are about humans and human connection, right? So in education, sometimes you hear about people say, oh, AIs can create lesson plans. They can, offer feedback. People can use them to generate sort of their content and assessments until at some point you end up with AIs can do every single thing in this process. Where are people? What is the point of this anyways? The point is not to have AI do any of these things. The point is for people to learn and people to teach and to learn and teach from each other. And as soon as you disrupt that with AI, it's disrupting the whole point of it, right? And it's similar with science. People say, oh, we can have AI. They will generate our ideas or write our papers or summarize our papers or even run our experiments. And again, if AI does all of this, in what sense have we humans learned or made progress in science? The purpose of science is not to generate papers. The purpose of science is to create ideas as a shared community that we then use and learn from. Let's let the AI do all that while we go on the beach, but we know that's not actually going to happen. The AI will do all that while all of us die of poverty. Humans need to be a part of this process. And the same thing with art, writing, and culture. I mean, all of these things, people talk about having the AI do important things and sort of creating things. Maybe they can watch your movie for us and summarize it and sort of, what the fuck? Like, what is the purpose of life anyways, is to do these things. Why are you talking about AI doing these really important things for you? It's just, I don't mean to rant, but I just do not get it. So you can say no. And I think, all right, calm down. What else? I think this is all kind of related, but when you're trying to decide, what's the role of LLMs for me and in my life, or for other people, I think fundamentally a lot of where I'm coming from is that, what I value is the process and not the results. And I think that's true. We saw it is really mattering with education and learning, but it also matters with the connection and everything. LLMs, to the extent that they make things easy for us, they offload some of the stuff. They're tempting, they're junk food, but this can actually rob us of growth. And again, it comes down to what's the point? What is the point? My kid made a sign which hangs in our house, difficult road that leads to beautiful destinations. And I keep thinking of that. Don't, don't make a life for yourself where all of the difficulty, all the friction is gone, because that is not a happy life. And and I think the sort of sense of why we want to offload to LLMs is, LLMs they're useful. They create output. They create an end. And it doesn't matter what the, means is, whether the LLM did it or we did, we get this cool thing made by the LLM. And I think, no, I've always thought this is a very silly question in the first place, because the end, if you're narrowly defining the end by the single thing, then maybe it's a question, but the means defines the end. The means shapes the end. So LLMs, maybe they create some thing that we couldn't otherwise do, but the means of it, the other parts of the end of LLM usage are the things I've talked about in the last video, which is, our senses of agency and self-reliance and well-being and our development and the health of the world we live in. Those are part of the ends too. And so anyone who's asking about sort of, justifying LLM usage by the end, one narrow end, ask, well, what's the rest of the ends? Because the means, the fact that it's an LLM is defining this whole space of ends that I don't know if we really want. All right. Another thing I want to say is, a lot of the hype mechanism I've seen is basically undermining people's sense of their own agency and expertise. Sort of, oh, you don't understand enough about AI, trust us, right? And part of why I made these videos was to give you, normal people, enough knowledge to believe in yourself, essentially. You have enough knowledge to disentangle some of the outright lies and everything. But also, I think that most people have the common sense to weed through and identify lies and hype and things that don't make sense and avoid FOMO if you trust enough to use your common sense. And by what common sense, I mean, think about your actual experience with actual humans and actual organizations. Ask yourself, who is benefiting from these narratives? Who is getting hurt from these narratives? Trust yourself. And I don't mean don't listen to experts. I'm trying to do the opposite thing of what disinformation researchers are doing, which is making us distrust each other and ourselves. I mean, trust yourself to weed through and figure out when someone is lying to you, to trust experts who provide evidence and think through people's motivations, right? Don't let people tell you, oh, trust me, you just don't know enough about AI, you're a Luddite. I've given you lots of tools in these videos. If you've had the stamina to make it through 7 videos, you have the intelligence and attention span to make good decisions. Let yourself, right? When you hear about some claim, you don't need to understand the AI of it. Think about the motives and the goals behind people making those claims. Think about what the world would have to be for those claims to be true. Think about whether it meshes with what you know of humans and organizations and how they work. Look into details, be wary of vagueness, and you have the skills to figure out a lot, okay? So do that. I trust you. And that kind of relates to number 9, which is hold on to your values. It's kind of a scary world we live in. There's a lot going on here. A lot of hard choices that need to be made. And my only advice, this is the thing that I try to do most, is figure out what figure out what matters to you, what kind of person you want to be, and make choices based on that. None of us can predict the future. For me, I look at the bad impacts of LLM, as far as I can tell, are going on now. I don't want to be a person who is supporting that any more than I can avoid. I know we all live in a world with strong constraints. You might care about other things than this. That's fine. But just be clear about that. Again, what people are trying, what the FOMO, the hype and everything is trying to get you to do is to get panicked and not think about what really matters. Don't let them control the conversation. Step away, think about what the things that matter to you and make choices based on that. And then finally, I guess fundamentally, I see AI and LLMs as it's really a question of power. Big tech, authoritarian, increasingly authoritarian governments, industry, oligarchy, they are trying to consolidate power and take it from little people. And I consider myself a little person, even though in some sense I have more power than many. I'm lucky enough to be at a good university. But we are mostly all little people compared to that. But we have great power. The reason that they're trying to do this and get LLMs everywhere. I know that I'm actually thinking about more than LLMs right now, but LLMs are a tool of this. The reason they're trying to do this is because they need to. They can't just take it from us. We have to give it. So don't give up your power. Don't create in you a reliance on an external tool you don't understand and you can't control. As much as possible, avoid that. Don't embed these things in unless you really feel confident in your autonomy, because you're ceding that over to someone. All right, that's the end. I'm afraid I sounded very conspiracy theory-ish in this last part, but I do think, we have to be aware of the world we live in, and I think that's what's going on here. And regardless, I leave you with these rules for happiness, actually not rules for happiness, making AI maybe suck slightly less. Here they are. Thanks a lot, and take care.